Is it warmer climate?
Warming for man-made reasons?
Okay.
I mean, I think it is, honestly. Like, there's stats, there's graphs that show
There's
how...
stats and graphs. It's dangerous when you say the end of the world is coming and the only solution is for you to give the rich, educated elite in the government all the power so that they can make it better. That's what people are afraid of.
Yeah.
I think I'll probably die if it gets 10 more degrees, honestly.
Imagine 120 degree summers. That's gonna be
God, that'd be insane. Welcome back to The Flip Side, the podcast where we bring you lighthearted and good-natured debates about a variety of interesting topics ranging from politics to social and cultural issues. We make a genuine effort to explore all sides of each issue, and the goal is always to find common ground instead of scoring points against each other. This is Pri.
Carson.
And Julian.
All right. So this is episode 6 of the pod. What are we talking about this time?
Something like that.
Yeah.
So we've been told for decades now that there is a climate catastrophe heading our way. Science says that the world is warming and that humans are the cause, but over half of Americans disagree. Is climate change just a hoax designed to drive us towards communism? How do we know that temperature changes we've seen aren't just part of natural cycles in Earth?
Right.
If global warming is real, can we even do anything about it? And are 2 degrees Celsius really going to bring about the end of humanity?
It might, honestly.
We will talk about all that and more on this installment of Flipside. Yeah. We're missing our host Hussein today. He will be missed. I guess he had better things to do than debate about the end of the world. So,
Okay, it is actually climate change real.
basically, the only thing you can do here is look up the stats, and from 1900 to 2020, the average world surface temperature increased by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and the years 2016 and 2020 are tied for the warmest years on record in recent history, as in like the past hundreds, thousands of years even. There's also data that shows carbon dioxide parts per million are rising based on air samples taken periodically all throughout the globe for decades now. And in some sense, that's all there is to it when you try and look at the stats. I mean, I haven't spent my whole career studying the climate, obviously. And so, I mean, there's not much you can say besides just looking at the statistics. What do y'all think?
I would also add that the parts per million has doubled since when it was first started, recorded. But also, if you look at the average like ocean level, there is like a trend of it rising as well. But that could also just be from other factors.
Well, so first we'll just talk about, is the temperature rising on Earth?
No, yeah, I think it is. I mean, it also just correlates with carbon dioxide.
Do we think? I mean, it's a stat. That's not really something we can think about, Carson. Like,
well, that's why we're asking the question, but we can go into a little bit later some of the reasons why so many people don't believe in it. So
yeah, I mean, it's 100% a fact. Like when we compare it to decades before, it's 100% temperature have risen. It's not insane, like 20 degrees. It's like a couple of degrees. But I think the point is, even a couple of degrees makes a huge difference, or at least that's what the stats are projecting. I think we can go deeper into why it's increasing.
Well, yeah. I mean, everyone's very familiar with this by now. As more carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere,
middle school stuff.
It creates a greenhouse effect where the heat is trapped in Earth's atmosphere, and it's kind of a compounding effect that increases over time. And the hypothesis is that humans have been burning fossil fuels, and that releases all this carbon into the atmosphere, which is increasing the greenhouse gases and creating the warming effect.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple graphs, and I think we'll maybe put it up on the video, but it's basically the correlation of carbon dioxide increase and temperature increase have quite literally been the same thing. It's on the graph, when you put it on, it's parallel to each other. So I think we can 100% agree that greenhouse effect and carbon dioxide plays a huge role in temperature. There's no debate on that, honestly.
There are so people say, though, the Earth is an incredibly complex system, and the temperature now is actually well above the well below the average throughout all of Earth's history. So throughout most of the history of the Earth, it's been very cold. So we're actually at a relatively cold period of Earth's history. Or it's been relatively very hot on Earth is what I'm trying to say. And then also there's solar flares and changes in Earth's orbit that brings us closer or further from the sun, and even a slight variation in that can have huge impacts. And volcanoes and other natural sources of carbon can be releasing carbon dioxide. So lots of people like to make arguments that there's no way we can know that it is man-made because there's so many extra factors.
I don't know.
True. But part of that argument with what you were saying with natural sources of carbon, that's acknowledging that the Earth is warming because of increased greenhouse gases.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a given. Yeah,
like are we talking specifically about whether does climate change exist, or is the Earth temperature actually warming in a trend that will, shift the balance towards
is it
warmer climate?
Warming for man-made reasons?
Okay.
I mean, I think it is, honestly. Like, there's stats, there's graphs that show
there's
how
stats and graphs.
it's a basic
but it's
effort,
like, you see the correlation of carbon
Look
and
at the stats and the graphs.
That's all I can say. Because
well, yeah, but you can't capture the sources. It's a non-point
Right.
source pollution.
Right,
you
right.
can't capture the source of carbon just from looking at a graph like that.
Mhm.
That's why this is still a hypothesis. I mean, it hasn't there's no way you can 100% prove the fact that man,
I think we can prove it based on population for sure. Like the population increase and the correlation to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I think that's what the graphs are. That's what I meant.
Well, but it still could just be a correlation, not causation.
exactly.
Okay,
um,
sure.
But
yeah.
I mean, the counter argument, first of all, scientists have been studying this, and there is quite an incentive for scientists to find counter arguments that disprove global warming,
Right.
given, I guess, all the negative reasons around it and all the dangers of it. It would be nice if someone could disprove it, and then we don't have to worry about it, obviously. But there are people devoting their lives to studying each one of these and kind of seeing, okay, do solar flares, have they been increasing recently? Does that correlate with increases in temperature? What about volcanic activity? Has that been higher recently? And can that explain the increase in carbon? There's a couple different scientific things to go into. I guess just the main thing is normal warming and cooling cycles of the Earth last tens of thousands of years. And we can tell that by looking at ice cores and glaciers and a couple different scientific methods that we're not experts in, obviously, but there's ways to tell the temperatures of Earth hundreds and millions of years in the past. And you can tell now that the temperature is increasing at a rate that's 10 times faster than it did in the past.
Yeah, because I mean, most of the stats I get from and topics that I talk about is from my class. I have an astronomy class, and in that we were talking about how if you're 20 years old, the 30% of the carbon that's produced has been during our lifetime in the last 20 years. So that's where you know that it's gotten exponentially high. So I think we can definitely have some indications to it probably is man-made. I think that's how we get the derivations that, that the fault is ours and not just the environment.
Like we said, you can't prove causation. You can prove
Well, but
correlation.
It's a huge
The one thing
though. It's not like it's 5% increase. It's a 30% difference,
Yeah,
right?
Sure. And I think you mentioned glaciers as well. Like we've also, I think 2023 was the lowest or the least amount of ice that was in Antarctica as well. That was
Right.
measured or something like that. So
yeah. So I mean, scientists all around the globe are observing, using a bunch of different methods, even just visually observing glacier size, that the world is warming. So we covered that. And then one last scientific fact that maybe will help prove the causation. You can tell carbon isotopes from fossil fuels are different from those
Right.
from natural sources like decomposing vegetation or outgassing from the ocean. Those also add carbon to the atmosphere, but we can look at the carbon isotopes and tell that specifically carbon from fossil fuels has been increasing over the past couple of years and not natural carbon. So all that put together sounds like it makes pretty convincing case that the Earth is warming, temperatures are increasing, and it's probably, with all likelihood, man-made. So if that's the case, why are there climate deniers?
That's a tough question, but I think people just don't want to believe in it. Like they don't want to do anything about it, so they're like, it doesn't exist. Let me just get on with my life and not care about it, right? Like, because if you don't believe it's real, you don't need to care about it.
I think that's part of the reason. I think other parts of it have to do with, I mean, for one, if you look at what you can do as an individual,
Right.
there's only so much that that you can do, and policy policy changes that would fight climate change also have negative impacts on both the economy and, I mean, especially in developing nations, because you look at renewable sources of energy being a lot more expensive than non-renewable, like coal production.
But why does that cause people to just say it doesn't exist at all? Just because it's easier than debating the solutions? Or
Yeah, I think that's it. It's because they haven't observed anything in their lifetime that's catastrophically changed due to climate change, right? They're like, oh yeah, the occasional 100-degree temperature, the occasional hot days, or the occasional super cold days. It's not bothering them enough to be like, there's actually something happening, I think that's the biggest thing.
Agree. I just want to say, like, my original point that I was trying to get to is, I mean, in this day and age, like we live in such a polarization in America right now.
Right.
And the issue has been highly politicized. So when you have one political party, aligning with what I just said earlier, I mean, if people, adhere to that political ideology, they're gonna, it's easier to believe certain things like climate change isn't real when it becomes
it's become a political issue.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me give you the stats for this. Only 46% of Americans say human activity is the primary reason the Earth is warming. 14% of Americans say there's no evidence of the Earth warming at all. So
that's crazy, actually.
Only, less than half of people think man-made.
Actually believe in it, yeah.
So definitely worth looking into why that's the case so that you can help more effectively convince them. I've got a couple more points. Basically, people are distrusting the experts and the science for some reason. So it's worth looking into where that distrust comes from, because they can't see the evidence with their own eyes and they don't trust the experts. So that those two combined means that they don't believe. So some reasons why they might not trust the experts is because predictions have a track record of being wrong about the climate specifically, and about the end of times and academics have long been forecasting the end of humanity for various reasons. Like in the 1960s, Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, which said millions would be starving by the 1970s due to overpopulation. The population was only 3.5 billion back then, by the way. Obviously, his predictions did not come true. In the 1970s, they were predicting a new ice age and thought it would be 11 degrees colder by the 2000s. Now we're saying the opposite. In the 1980s, there was an acid rain craze, and this is actually when the first talk of global warming started. But the predictions were wildly pessimistic. A UN official in 1989 said entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the trend isn't reversed by the year 2000. And then one last example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, celebrity politician.
That sounds pretty recent.
Says in 2019, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it? This is our World War II.
I think this itself shows the problems. It's like a handful of these scientists are not as educated people. Not saying that we are, but not as educated people in the realm just give out some false informations based on their predictions, and everybody takes the word of those.
I think sometimes they're overconfident, overstating how confident they are in their own stats or the effects of their stats. Like the statistics might be accurate, but extrapolating the effects of them is where it gets dicey.
Yeah. And also due to, I mean, a lot of research is funded by private organizations. And if there's an organization such, say like an oil company that wants to like downplay the effects or try to find alternative explanations for why this is happening, then it could be possible that, a research paper is published that has some, is
How
motivated by that to some degree.
right? How do we then differentiate? Like, how are we gonna know which scientists are saying the real stuff and which ones are motivated by political or private gains?
Well, that's the thing. Like, I don't know if people have time to go through every
Right.
expert and see who's funding them. I mean, that is also something I was going to say. It's not unheard of for scientists to have their own political bias.
Mhm.
They could be funded by people that are expecting them to prove climate change, and they have incentives to fudge the data or draw the wrong conclusions from it in that regard. Or they could just be making mistakes and being too confident in their predictions.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
why the peer review, process exists, but that's not infallible. I mean, we've already like seen how Carson said a lot of these predictions can be wrong, even if they are like by trusted academics who are like leaders in their field, right? So you can't really, even in like the academic side of things, it seems like you can't really trust what you see. And if you think about the American public, like what percentage of the American public do you think reads academic journals? Like
That's
honestly,
true, 100%.
is that your nightly reading?
It's headlines. yeah, that's definitely not my nightly
Headlines
reading.
tend to exaggerate what's in the studies.
Exactly. Yeah, because we find out what's in them from media, for instance, and what
And
is
they
media
twist
known
it.
to do. Exactly.
Exactly. I mean, there's nothing we can do about
One
it.
last point about the distrust of science and experts with COVID, that just furthered the divide, because there were actually a lot of lies and just mistakes coming out from the government where they got on TV and pretended like they knew what was best for everyone, but then they're switching their takes on whether masks are effective and whether you need an N95 versus a cloth, or maybe a cloth mask is actually worse for your health than not wearing one because you're touching it with your hands all the time. And kids can't go to school because they are going to be spreading the disease, but then that's actually way more harmful for the kids than any chances they would get of getting the infection. Fauci was the main figurehead of the government and the main expert telling us what to believe. And then later it came out that he covered up the lab leak theory and downplayed them because he had funded research in the Wuhan Virology Institute, where it's now widely accepted that that's where the virus actually came from. So people definitely have a reason to be distrustful of the experts and the people that are telling them, we know what's best for everyone, just listen to us and give us more power.
Yeah. And also building on top of that, I mean, even with COVID, like you said, but this one study by the Pew Research Center says only 4% of the public believe that the American, have trust in the American government system, that it's doing
That's crazy.
that it's working
That's
extremely or very well today, right? Where 23% say it is working somewhat well, 7 in 10 say the system is working not too or not well at all, right?
I want to go back to the or the politicalization, because I think that's maybe the most important point, and then we can move on. So lots of people say the climate alarmism is just fear mongering that's being used to apply political pressure. Also, alarmism in general tends to fuel skepticism, because when you're making claims of doom and catastrophe that are disproportionate to what people are actually seeing or what scientists are even predicting, then it makes it seem like politicians and people making these arguments have ulterior motives. Some provisions that were actually put forward in the Green New Deal were getting rid of all farting cows and airplanes, retrofitting every building in America, and hidden into the same bill, well, not hidden, but it mentioned also we want to guarantee a job with a family-sustaining wage to everyone and guarantee economic security for everyone unable and even unwilling to work. So apparently climate change is so pressing and catastrophic of an issue that we also need to lump full-scale communism into the solution. So I mean, yes, the market can't account for all externalities like air pollution and like collective action around climate change. But also people are very adverse to this idea that we need large-scale top-down control from the government to restructure the whole society. And basically what they're seeing, it goes back to the lack of credibility. It's reminiscent of the rich elites saying, we know what's best for you. We've got all the facts, and we're going to usher in a utopia using the government power, which is reminiscent of what happened even in the 20th century. And we know how that goes when a elite vanguard that has control over society and thinks they know best for everyone when they try to take control like that. So that's the deepest part you can go into.
Yeah, I mean, that's agreeable. People don't want to, be led by more powerful people always. They like to have control to themselves, and I think this is one of the ways they try to keep control with themselves, is going against the elite beliefs. But yeah.
All right, so we've established that it's real, the data is there, but is it actually worth worrying about?
Okay, I guess we'll look into that right now.
So let's go straight into the direct impacts from the heat. The global average temperature is predicted to rise 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century if emissions to continue to grow at the same pace. And that doesn't sound like too much, but it's better. Lots of times people look at the Celsius statistics of like 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius and think 2 degrees, that's nothing.
Yeah.
But you have to convert it to Fahrenheit.
Oh, right.
7 degrees is actually seems like a decent amount. But also there's more extreme highs and lows is the problem. So do y'all think the direct heat impact is a big deal?
I mean, yeah, 100%. Right? You said 7 degrees is kind of crazy.
Well, imagine, so that's an average, right? So that means that there's obviously going to be changes that
or even higher.
Yeah, well, exactly, because I mean that's the average. So you're probably going to see
even 10
places
degrees
that go down in temperature potentially, whereas imagine like in desert areas we're going to see a lot more was it aridification or something like that, where desertification. Oh my god. Desertification, where things become desert, right? And if you think about cities like Phoenix that are already struggling with water supply, how are they going to be able to maintain a larger population with diminished water supply, higher temperatures, and longer summers?
Yeah, like heat waves and droughts are an issue. In terms of directly dying from heat, actually cold temperatures cause more deaths. According to a CDC study, twice as many people die from extreme cold as heat. And a 2015 study found that cold deaths outnumbered heat deaths by a factor of 15. And this is because of seasonal factors like influenza and stuff like that.
Yeah. In terms of...
So maybe global warming will save lives in at least the northern hemisphere.
It'll counteract the heat with cold temperatures?
No, I'm saying it's better for those places to get warmer because more people die from cold.
Well, what about us then?
Well, yeah, Texas is kind of an L, but
maybe just give up on Texas.
Most of the country's summers are 80 degrees max, so they could use an extra 10 degrees.
They could use it, huh? Okay. I think I'll probably die if it gets 10 more degrees, honestly.
120 degree summers? That's
God, that'd be insane. I mean, I think this year itself, I think I saw the stat where 68 days are already over 100 degrees in temperature. Over the past 100 years, Austin averages 15 100-degree days per year.
Oh, okay.
This may increase as a factor to 4 to 6 times in the next 100 years. We already see the effects right now. For example, this year, we've had 68 over 100-degree days. 68.
68. I thought you said 38.
No, 68.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
Dude. What?
And they're saying this may increase to 90 in the next recent years, which is just crazy.
No, bro, we gotta move out of Texas.
So in terms of comfort, like you said, 120 degree summers definitely doesn't sound fun. I mean, I've had soccer camps in the middle of the summer days, and yeah, definitely not a fan of more heat. So, but in terms of actual deaths from it, it's predicted that temperature deaths due to extreme heat and cold will increase to 3,900 up to 9,300. So
It's crazy.
I mean, that's a lot, but that's not that crazy. That's
Out of the
like,
population,
in the grand scheme
yeah.
of things, that's not the
7
main
billion
issue with
people.
this. The main issue might be the other things we're going to talk about now, which is let's start with rising sea levels. Do you think this is the biggest problem, or
No,
You
not
don't
at all.
think it's a problem?
Not at all, because if you look at, I mean, sure, like the majority of the human population lives along coasts, but that's not to say that we can't have more sustainable development in areas that aren't located on floodplains. I mean, Houston, I'm looking at you. Building more sidewalks on floodplains is not really a good idea. So maybe rethinking our urban planning could help mitigate those effects, right?
Okay.
So I don't think rising sea levels are the biggest issue here, but
maybe that's for flooding, which is like the extreme weather side. But what about around the coast, like half of San Francisco being underwater or something like that?
Yeah, but is that like actually gonna happen though? That's the thing.
No. So sea level, or by 2050, an additional 0.3 meters.
That
of sea level
doesn't
rise
sound
is
crazy at all.
By 2100, expected to rise 1.1 meters, which is 3.5 feet.
See,
So
that's the problem with these, stats, is that it just doesn't seem like it's a huge deal.
exactly.
When
But
it's 100 years
you
later.
Okay, look.
well,
imagine-
it's 100 years later, and it doesn't seem like a huge deal.
Yeah, even 100 years later, it's only like, 3 feet? It's like, it's crazy, sure, but it's not that crazy.
Now imagine if you have like on aggregate, every hurricane that hits Houston, as if the storm surge was 3 feet higher than it is on average right now. Imagine that, because that's basically what we'd be facing. Because unless things were elevated, I mean, you can build levees, sure, right? You can build seawalls, but at the end of the day, unless we change how things are built right now, you have to add on like that. You have to add on the changes that are predicted to like the extreme cases that we have.
Yeah, the storm surge and like high tides.
Yeah, exactly.
But I feel like storm surges, like it's not a multiplicative thing. Like
No, it's not. But I mean,
if the sea level rises 3 feet, then the max storm surge rises 3 feet.
but that's a lot if you think about it.
I guess that at that point, it's going super far inland.
Yeah, it goes a lot farther inland.
Well, yeah, I've got a stat that a sea level rise of 3 feet would impact 4.2 million Americans. But the thing is, this is going to be a super gradual process up until for the next 100 years. It's not like a tsunami, which people sometimes act like, where it's just going to come and then suddenly all of California is going to be underwater or something like that. Basically, what's probably going to happen realistically is housing prices near the coast will go down, and then there'll be less new houses being built along the coast, and gradually the cities will shift inland. I guess that doesn't work for like super flat coastal cities, but most of them, I feel like,
Yeah, but
they just shift the houses back like literally one row, and then the 3 feet rise doesn't matter.
I mean, you look at cities like New York, for instance, where every time they have a flood or a storm, all the subways flood. So I think you have to look at the infrastructure not only on the coast, but also say underground or in areas that are prone to flooding.
okay.
There's a meme where Ben Shapiro is making this argument about people selling. They're like, it's just a gradual sea level rise. Why don't you just sell your house? And then the meme is like, to who, Ben Shapiro? Fucking Aquaman? But honestly, like, if you look at the California coast, housing prices are not going down. So that just shows you how much people are worried about their house being flooded in the future. They're not.
They're
at
not.
least at this point. And it is going to be a gradual shift.
Yeah, I think the biggest things that we can worry about is probably, like you said, the storm surges. Those are probably the only huge thing that could impact us. Like if a hurricane comes, like I forgot the name of a hurricane, but one of the hurricanes, the increase was due to the sea levels. It does impact it greatly, but it's just if people care as much.
Yeah, but that is a perfect tie-in because we're talking about extreme weather right now. So, I mean, you have to keep in mind that like higher storm surge, combined with there is a theory that, well, maybe not a theory, but we're not entirely sure what the the effect of higher temperatures are going to have on the like amount of storms, hurricanes in particular, that we have per year.
Mm-hmm.
If that were to increase with higher sea levels, that would be something to keep in mind, because you would have more extreme weather events on the coastlines.
Right.
And
yeah.
also there's just more evaporation, which means more water vapor in the air, which makes heavy rain events 1.7 times more likely. So my house has been flooded twice. It's not
Doesn't
fun.
sound great.
So twice as much flooding seems like at least an issue, a nuisance to say the least. Lots of property damage, and there's not too many ways at first glance that you can like adapt and mitigate to flooding, I feel like. But then again, there's like you were mentioning before, you can do a lot of watershed management and water diversion. And
it's more sustainable planning, because as of right now, I mean, you see the city sprawl of, I keep using Houston as an example because we're from there. So it's something we understand, that something I could talk about more. I mean, you see the city sprawl there building on areas that, like urban developments,
It's where
remove
lakes and
the
stuff
ability
used to be.
for for the water to drain, right? And when
Right.
you have that, it floods a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on where you're building the cities, like, and the houses. If it's on high flood areas, it's probably not great. But I think they're trying to change that up by, building it higher up. But the problem is, it's still gonna flood underneath you and ruin the infrastructure. That's what the problem is.
well, I mean, just roads really is the infrastructure.
Roads, yeah, I guess so.
I mean, yeah, my house was built in a literal swamp, and they obviously didn't raise
good
it
job.
enough when they built it. So that's why it ended up being flooded twice. So better planning would account
Yeah.
for that.
What's next? What's the next big threat?
I do want to quantify it a bit more, though. So natural disasters resulted in 500 deaths in 2022, 175 billion of damage, which sounds like a ton of money, but you got to take into account that's only 0.7% of our GDP. And 60% of that cost was from loss of human life, which I'm really not sure how they quantify that part.
500. Okay.
But yeah, okay. Assuming severe weather events double in frequency and also double in severity. So I'm giving you a 4 times increase. That's still only 2,000 deaths and 2.8% of GDP, assuming it's not growing by 2,100. So once again, it seems like, at least in the United States, this is a much bigger problem for developing nations. Which is an unfortunate fact. But in terms of the United States, still doesn't seem like a huge amount of damage in dollars and deaths.
I mean, I think the point of that is that as much as we can say that it's not a lot, it's still a lot to the people who are dying, like it's a huge deal for them.
Yeah, but when you're making policy decisions, I mean, I'll go into it later.
So you're saying it's not going to
spend
be
the money in better ways to prevent more deaths is the argument.
Okay.
But we'll go into that later. So
All right.
do you want to go to famine and mass migration due to that?
Yeah, sure.
Well, what's much to talk about on that? I mean,
Well, I mean, I can't really talk about this without going somewhat into our next point here, but
Habitat.
yeah, because so I'm just gonna mention it briefly. Like there is I don't know if you guys have heard, there's an insect die-off where, hold on, I had the number down here, but basically because of habitat loss and also partially due to climate change, the amount of local pollinators we have has been, having we're heavily declining, and that means that there could be a strain on our agriculture and also our food supply.
yeah,
going
I
forward.
think honestly, more than it affects us, I think it might affect like animals and the environment more. I think that's what it is. Like in terms of crops cultivation to, how the high heat affects plant growth. I think that's where the problems arise. Those are the root of the problems rather than
You think this is the biggest problem?
it could be, honestly.
Wait, you think like plants dying is the biggest problem?
Yeah, compared
Crops.
to crops
Like heat waves and droughts
and animals,
impact
like
crop production.
habitat stuff, because I think feel like that gives a more like butterfly effect, like that affects it and then it affects another thing, blah 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 blah, rather than rising sea levels. Or
How about this though? It's like, say that extreme weather events forces us to relocate our crops, forces us to build more crops, and a growing population also makes us produce more food, right? That leads to habitat destruction. And as of right now, the total mass of insects is falling at 2.5% a year, and 40% of insects are declining, right? So that means that, I mean, look, I don't think it's really hard to explain how important like local pollinators are for how productive our
100%.
agriculture is, right?
Exactly.
So
which is what I'm saying. Like, I feel like
They
that's
build
the
off each
bigger
other.
issue than the other stuff that we talked about, because this has a direct effect in our day-to-day lives and, food basically, which is what the biggest problem is. Like, that's definitely gonna, like, we've seen like the littlest stuff, like if I don't know, a chicken farm gets affected by the flu, egg prices increase like crazy and everybody makes a big deal about it.
Yeah.
Imagine like normal stuff, a whole crop, you can't grow the normal rice.
Well,
or
imagine
something.
every agricultural product
Exactly.
being much more expensive than it is now.
Exactly. I think that's where it instantly affects people, and then people will understand the effects of climate change and how it's actually affecting their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I guess I tend to not take claims of like famine super seriously due to, I mean, we're producing so much excess food now in the United States, especially now, once again, in developing nations and poorer nations, they do have this, they're affected by famine like annually or every decade. There's like a huge famine that kills lots of people and they're starving very often. But I feel like that's more of an issue with distribution of the food and purchasing power of the citizens. And but yeah, I can see how, like you're talking about the pollinators, if there's like a threshold that we pass where the climate changes rapidly, or there's a butterfly effect where the ecosystems rapidly collapse, then that can have unforeseen consequences on the agriculture.
Yeah.
100%.
And I guess that can lead us into, will this, like, I feel like if it's a gradual change over the next 100 years, then we can adapt to that with our food production, and food production is only going to scale exponentially with new technologies. But you could have these cases where you hear about a tipping point in the climate change or a runaway greenhouse effect where it's compounding on itself. And we reach some sort of tipping point where it's accelerating every year and there's nothing we can do to stop it. That's where you get drastic climate changes.
I think that's the other thing, like you said about technology advancing. Maybe like in the next 100 years, we'll find something to, even if something bad does happen, we have control over it. I think that's what people are hoping for as well. If we can...
And I want to talk about that in the next section.
Okay.
But so people know these positive feedback loops basically are where some of the impacts of climate change can result in faster warming. So for example, the polar ice caps melting means less light is reflected off Earth's surface, which means they melt faster, and you got a feedback loop there. And then water vapor is a greenhouse gas, so more evaporation causes more water vapor, which causes more evaporation. Yeah. So these sort of cycles can create the compounding effects that people are worried about.
Not even that, but imagine the desalinization of oceans means that weather patterns change, which some areas are going to be more impacted by severe weather events because how the air currents, the undersea currents.
Yeah.
Have you heard about that one, was it the Atlantic Channel is predicted to collapse within our lifetime?
I did hear about that.
It'll severely change the climate of Europe and make it a lot colder.
Yeah, so even though the temperature is gradually rising, there could be some threshold where it drastically changes weather patterns and has rapid effects, even though it's a gradual cause.
Yeah,
it's feedback loop, exactly.
A couple of degrees could make a huge difference in the ocean and weather changes and all that stuff. So,
well, that's just a specific example.
Exactly.
But I will say, I'm pretty skeptical of these tipping points that people like to talk about. Geological timescales are normally on tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, and due to natural warming in the past, did we see these feedback loops where there was a giant temperature change? I mean, all the art scientists have been telling us that temperature changes in the past were over tens of thousands of years. So were those feedback loops not present then is kind of what I'm wondering.
But has it already gradually happened for the tens of thousands of years, and we might see an effect today? That's a possibility too, right?
But we're colder now than we've been for most of Earth's history. So like the Earth's temperature has ranged from very extreme highs and very extreme lows, and I don't know. I'm skeptical of the runaway effect.
Yeah. I mean, it just goes back to that. There's not enough,
and they're very hard to predict too.
Believability and
tiny changes in the variables that they're using in these models can have giant effects. So that's why they have been saying with this, like, we're not sure how bad the storms are going to be. We're not sure what the exact impacts on agriculture are going to be because they don't know all the factors. But
yeah, there's only so much you can predict. So it just comes down to we know enough to take some precautionary methods. I think that's what it comes down to. Like, the chance of it happening, is it better to be, better to put our research to stopping that from happening, even if it's a small chance? I think that's what people are trying to do, or at least the government is pushing us to do.
I mean, we're going to talk about that in potential
in the next one, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on into we talked about all the issues and all the predictions that's going to happen,
the horrible things that are going to happen to us in the next 100 years.
Is there any solutions to those? Can we prevent any of those? Could we, if something does happen, can we fix it?
Already,
it could be too late.
Yeah,
but are we? That's the question. We'll get into it.
Can we separate it between future and present technology?
I think so.
If you think about it, I mean,
well, let's start with renewables.
Well, yeah, but we already have renewables, right? We have wind, solar, hydro, nuclear. Well,
not yet nuclear,
fission,
but
right?
yes.
We have fission.
We definitely
not
have
fusion.
Yeah.
Fission's good, though.
Is it good enough? I don't think so.
It has its downsides.
Do you want to start focusing on nuclear to begin?
Yeah,
if you want.
Okay.
Lead us off, Carson.
So nuclear is actually the safest source of power generation that we have, which takes some people by surprise, even accounting for all the nuclear disasters, because fossil fuels obviously have air pollution impacts that kill lots of people. And even wind turbines are dangerous to operate on and maintain. So modern day nuclear reactors are very safe. So there's not really any rational reason to be afraid of a new Chernobyl. But
people just stick on that one and think all the nuclear stuff associated with it.
3 Mile Island, Fukushima, those.
There's been a lot of the older reactors, but even with taking those disasters into account, it's not as bad as other options, which, especially when you're considering non-renewables as the alternative. So
yeah,
people are trying to they lump in nuclear with oil and natural gas and coal as in technologies we need to ban. So it's great because the only waste is the radioactive uranium or whatever isotope remains after they use it. But this waste is actually very easy to be contained and much better than just billowing out toxic fumes into the atmosphere. Obviously, we can keep them very contained and put them in safe bunkers. So the question is, why don't we use it more? And that's because it's probably one of the most expensive sources of energy. It takes a lot of upfront investment to build them. And the cost is $6,000 per kilowatt versus oil and natural gas are both $1,000. So
it's also become highly politicized at this point as well.
100%, but it's also people are already complaining about every single thing on prices, right? From gas to electricity to everything. So if we start using nuclear and if it's 6 times as much, people will go crazy. I think that's the reason why we haven't done it. I think the government can afford to build them. I don't think that's the problem. Honestly, we spend money on so many things. But I just think the people are not willing to pay. I think that's what it comes down to. Unless we get it to
I think that's part of it.
Status where everybody...
for all the renewables, which we have a section on later.
Yeah. I would also like to point out that it's kind of interesting to see how a lot of environmentalists are against nuclear because of, radioactive waste, and it's gonna, what if there's another disaster and it basically poisons our environment even more. So there's actually a lot of pushback from environmentalists, which is kind of interesting considering that it is the safest and cleanest.
And it's also reliable, which is something that you don't get from solar panels and wind.
Yeah.
So for it being more expensive, there's an interesting case study. Germany basically doesn't use any nuclear, and they went all into solar and wind, and now their energy costs went up 50% in recent years due to the push for green energy. Versus France, they use 75% nuclear energy, and their energy costs are cheaper than Germany. So I have no idea how they did that, but that's an example of how you can bring the cost down, and maybe after the initial investment.
Okay, right. So I guess after the initial investment,
at scale,
you can get the prices to go down. I guess it's just like anything else.
There's probably ways that you can actually get it cheaper.
Right.
So I'm not sure exactly what the case was for France, why they got it so cheap, but just something to note.
Yeah, and also to go back on the environmentalist thing, it's like in every single topic that we talk about, it always comes down to headlines. People just believe the headlines and go with it. The headlines that nuclear is bad, the headlines that one catastrophe has happened like decades ago, right?
Well, Fukushima happened 15 years ago?
Exactly.
3 Mile Island, also around then.
It's like things have changed a lot. We've advanced a lot. I think we know enough information to fix ourselves and increase the safety, and and we got to understand it's just better than the other options that we have. So I think that's the problem.
I've heard you can tell if people / politicians mainly are actually afraid of climate change based on their attitude towards nuclear. So if they're spewing all this climate alarmism, and then they're super against nuclear as a viable solution, then that means that they're
not educated.
Either that, or they have ulterior motives.
Their climate is on their political agenda, not their,
not the best interest. Okay, sure. Right. Yeah, 100%.
So let's do solar and wind pros and cons, I guess.
Yeah, and specifically, are we talking about solar panels? Because there's also those solar farms where it's mirrors. Yeah, it points at one tank of water that heats up and produces.
I mean, all variations. Well, okay, so there's into like giant solar farms that governments build. Well, I'm not sure if they're privately built these days or not, but giant solar farms that have that sort of technology, and there's a couple different variations. But then there's individual solar panels, which cost twice as much if you are just like putting solar panels individually on your roof or something. So solar energy is actually very cheap. It's about the same now as natural gas, $1,060 per kilowatt. So, but the main issue is the reliability.
Well, reliability, and also you have to replace them and they can't be recycled as well, right?
Isn't the instant...
there's a higher maintenance cost, isn't there?
The first investment cost is pretty high though, isn't it? To put on, for example, on your house, the roof panels. I've heard that it's quite high.
I think it pays themselves off though in that case.
So
for years, you won't be able to get back the money. You know what I mean?
Oh,
that's what the thing is.
Yeah. I looked at my question looking at this was, okay, solar actually sounds, it's
good,
cheap, and pretty great. So what are the reasons why not everyone just has them on their houses right now? And why don't we put them on every single building? Well, they're still pretty expensive for an individual to buy. The Tesla solar system is about up to $23,000, and they pay for themselves within 9 to 12 years. So, I mean, that's a decent
crazy
investment, but people don't have that.
I might die in those 9 to 10 years and never get back my money.
Okay, yeah. So
you know what I mean? That's insane. Unless it's instantly giving me what I paid back, I probably won't do it.
Okay. And as far as what you said about like the manufacturing costs, I thought this was one of the main arguments is that they can't be recycled, and also it takes a lot of mining of these rare earth minerals and a lot of manufacturing costs in terms of carbon emissions. But they basically become carbon neutral after 3 years, and they last 30 years. So
Interesting. Wait, that's gone a
that's
long
still
way
a
then.
positive investment.
It's not
Yeah.
bad. That doesn't sound bad.
That's
And then the
crazy.
reasons why people might not be putting them on their roof. I saw on Reddit people were saying they were quoted like $40K for their house. Depends on the region they're in and stuff, or they have bad roof orientation, or their roof is covered with snow half the year in most of the country. So
I think it also, like, we got to think about it. If you're building a house, right? Houses cost like 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 these days. Maybe a $10,000 investment, if it's 10,000, doesn't sound that bad when you're spending already that much. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like, maybe if you look at it that way, it's not too big of a deal. Yes, it's a huge investment if you're like going and putting it on like a single thing. But if you're already building your house and you're already paying 500,000,
I mean,
what's 10,000?
I think that's only part of the story, considering that housing prices have risen a lot more compared to the average person's income. So we can afford less things, and
Okay.
especially with houses. If you think about who's going to buy a house and who's going to be able to pay for an investment such as a solar panel, I mean, that's
But
only
it's
going to
gonna be the same people though.
older, wealthier individuals. Right?
Yeah, but at least even if they start, maybe it'll trickle down to us. That's what I'm hoping for.
Okay. So the main problems with solar and wind is that they work intermittently only 10 to 30% of the time, and no amount of technology is going to make the sun shine more regularly
Right.
or the wind blow more often.
Less clouds.
Yeah, which goes into the sun shining. So so we have to build reliable backup. So even if you can build enough solar capacity to service an entire city or an
Also,
entire
that's also requires
state,
land, by the way.
it uses a lot of land. Although I feel like we have a lot of land in the U.S. to
We do
use,
in
but
America.
not near cities, I guess. And maybe not in like the super sunny areas where they're actually useful.
Yeah.
But anyway, you have to build a giant battery and energy storage capacities if you want to do that, or you have to still have fossil fuels as a backup, which means you have to invest in building them anyway. So you might as well use them regularly. So instead,
Yeah, it's just not good enough. I think out of these options, just we come back to nuclear just being the best one.
Oh, yeah, build one in your house, Pri, and then tell us how that goes.
we can get the cost down.
Yeah.
And okay, so now this is probably the main argument people have against most climate change solutions, is that there's a massive economic cost to them that maybe isn't justified by the damage that climate change would cause, especially not anywhere near term. So direct impact, the obvious thing is that oil and natural gas is 5.6% of the US total employment and 8% of our GDP. So if you ban all oil and natural gas immediately, then that means
It's huge.
we go into a recession and millions of people are out of a job. So
Yeah. We also have to consider the fact that, I mean, we can never like fully ban oil because we rely on like plastics and everything else that comes from petrochemicals. So
Yeah, the oil industry
there's
is
going to be
huge.
dependence on it. Yeah. I
In
mean,
Texas,
not
too.
just for energy, like every product that
Exactly,
we
every
use.
product.
Yeah, exactly.
oil.
It's a huge thing. I mean, yeah, it's part of our day-to-day lives. We're too far deep to pull out now.
at the very least, it's going to require restructuring at all levels, right?
Yeah, and that might take like honestly like hundreds of years if you're completely restructuring everything, or maybe even more than that.
Hundreds. I mean, our society hasn't existed for more than 100 like.
I think it
as
would
it
though.
is.
Like we're so far institutionalized with it, it's gonna be quite near impossible to.
I mean, with products and stuff, all it takes is like someone to invent an alternative, and then that's hopefully cheaper than natural gas, and then we just start using that. So I don't think it has to be super
Right.
gradual, but it would definitely be.
But people don't
just,
like change.
we can't just ban everything oil and natural gas immediately.
right.
There's also the indirect causes of increased energy prices. So energy is basically what drives the whole economy, considering that is how we convert that into work and productivity. And high energy costs are a main driver of inflation. So all that actually has real world impacts on people's lives right now. Like that means you can't buy as many groceries for your family. Think about all the complaints people have when gas prices rise a few dollars.
Right, a few dollars makes a huge difference.
And the thing is, this is going to impact poor people the most as when gas prices rise, not the rich, educated, liberal people that are normally the ones advocating so hard for climate policies. So that's something to consider.
Yeah.
100%. I mean,
And also our lawmakers as well. Yeah, they're not really necessarily poor, are they? I mean,
and it takes money away from other issues. So there's some research that I looked into about how we can actually spend money the most effectively today to prevent deaths, and some of the most pressing issues that we could easily solve today if we invested money into it instead of something like climate solutions. 400,000 mothers die in childbirth yearly worldwide. 2 million kids die in the first 28 days of life. Those are obviously due to lack of healthcare, childcare, and hospitals in these poorer countries. So
those are more important than...
They cause a ton of deaths, and they're cheap to fix.
Right.
Even some also really good examples. 1.3 million people die each year to tuberculosis, which is a curable disease, but it's just these people don't have the drugs that they need in developing nations. And then in the US, right now, this year, 112,000 people died from fentanyl overdose. So maybe we should invest some money into the border instead of climate solutions to prevent natural disasters that kill 500 per year.
Yeah.
That's the main thing.
No, I think I can, to an extent, agree with that, because it just doesn't seem as big of an issue when people are suffering day-to-day lives as, like you said, easily fixable issues. Maybe, but why haven't we done it though? That's the question.
I would argue fentanyl is not an easily fixable issue.
No, I'm saying compared to the stuff, those are probably easily fixable issues. And if it is easily fixable, why haven't we done it?
It is odd, like these issues that cause so many deaths and are cheap to fix, they're kind of boring. They don't make headlines. It's not what our politicians, unfortunately, are focused on aiding right now, because it's not the popular thing.
I feel like every time we talk about something, we're always like, there's stuff we can better spend money on. Like, even when people argue about like spending on the army or like sending aid, we always talk about there's stuff in our own country that we can improve, but they say that, but we never do it. I think that's the problem. Like,
because they've all become politicized, and the Democratic Party is not going to be happy. The Democratic base is not going to be happy with their politicians if they divert spending from green energy solutions into like foreign aid for Africa.
Yeah.
But that's a bigger issue that I don't really know the full answer for. But
well, can I also bring up the fact that these are a lot of the issues that you talked about are issues that impact us like short term, right? Climate change investment is generally a long-term investment, and depending on if you were, assuming that everything is going to get worse anyway, it's going to be a lot more expensive to fix it all, and
later on.
Yeah, exactly. And like a massive investment last minute where
that's a good
millions of people are on the brink of, dying because the city is going to get flooded. Like New York already, their transportation system is compromised every time there's a flood, right? It's going to be a larger cost to fix that later on than if we did gradual improvements starting from here on out as part of our GDP, like military spending, for instance. It's a small part of our GDP, but is consistent enough and effective enough to tackle some of these issues, because it's a lot easier to build up all our levees than it is to completely rebuild the city after Hurricane Katrina, because New Orleans, the only reason that failed was an extreme weather event with improper infrastructure, and that ended up being much more expensive than just upgrading the infrastructure. But that's just not what our politicians have focused on, like you said.
There is the argument is definitely that climate activists are thinking more long term, and that the economic damages from climate change in 100 years are going to be so drastic that it's worth it to put up the investment now. So, and I mean, it definitely doesn't seem like we should divert all spending away from green energy solutions right now, but it's honestly, it's a very hard job trying to divert funding to different sectors and best balance saving lives throughout the whole globe. So
yeah, I think people put a lot of pressure on these officials, right? But nobody can make up their minds because it creates issues on both sides. Like, if you're like, let's try to fix the long-term issue, people are going to be like, what about the short-term issue, and vice versa. I think that's where they're trying to focus on the more headline issues rather than these small ones.
Yeah, I mean, also with what you were saying, I think it's a lot more complicated on because a lot of these issues are in other parts of the world, but I think it's already become kind of a politicized argument whether we spend money here to help Americans or we give money elsewhere. Yeah. So that's also another issue that kind of goes into, like, where do we draw the line of how much money we give to solve these problems elsewhere?
Yeah, not many of the issues exist
in America.
So that's why it makes...
Yeah, we're fortunate enough that we don't have a tuberculosis pandemic every year. Yeah.
Okay, what's next?
So one more point for this. Countries, like we said, most of the environmental impacts of climate change are going to affect poor countries in the southern hemisphere, with droughts and famine, heat wave, and natural disasters. But it seems like, from what we've learned from our own societies, now we barely die from extreme cold. We've produced an excess of food, and we have air conditioning in all our homes.
Wait, but those stats that you said
we
are
don't
in the
die
US
from natural disasters, right? So why is that the case? Because we're more developed. And how do you become more developed as a developing nation is with cheap energy, which might involve burning coal, unfortunately, which is the dirtiest source of energy. But even oil and natural gas, at least, are cheap sources of energy that can help them become more developed and adapt to changes in climate change versus try to mitigate the issues by like forcing them down. It's almost like we became developed due to cheap energy in the Industrial Revolution, and then now we're like trying to pull the ladder up after us and not allow the developing nations to do the same.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people end up on, is that we do need to do these stuff. We can't always completely go out of it, because if you want to develop the country, we gotta, some intrinsic transactions have to happen. That's what the problem is. Because we're already developed, we're fine, but other countries might not be, and they've gotta put their resources towards fossil fuels or something to get their economy running.
I think part of the reason that that's such an argument is because some people argue that the economic model is changing, where increased globalization and technology and other areas of the world will help these countries develop faster and hopefully skip that stage of industrialization being super toxic for the environment. So
yes, we'll see.
I think that's part of the argument, but it's really, just sad to see how like the people who don't contribute to this problem suffer the most from it.
That is also true. It's definitely unfair for them, considering it's the developed nations that produce most of the,
specifically like the US and China, producing the most greenhouse emissions.
The population, we're 4% of the world, but we provide we do 15%.
Yeah, it's insane
to the thing. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So talking about globally, when we start thinking in global terms, there's this issue of global action and the tragedy of the commons. Have y'all heard of that phrase before?
Maybe.
So you have, okay. Basically, imagine you have a common area where everyone in the village can keep their cows or whatever, raising animals. Then everyone has an selfish incentive to put all their cattle. What's the word I'm looking for? cattle, yes, put all
He said
their
it.
cattle into the field, but then the field gets overgrazed because everyone does that, and then that results in a negative impact for everyone. So the idea is everyone has a selfish reason. For example, countries have a selfish reason to use cheaper energy to increase their GDP on a national stage and be more competitive on a global scale. But if every country is doing that, then none of them are investing in green energy, which means there's a negative impact for everyone.
Yeah, I think, well, I guess if the ones that are already industrialized and developed, if they start doing it, maybe it can fix the negative issues then. Like, by the time these countries, the less developed countries, get to being developed, maybe we're out of the whole emissions game and, are more green.
Well, we are. I mean, the U.S., we used to have a huge manufacturing base, but whenever, globalization came along, we gave a lot of our manufacturing to China, and now the U.S. has like the cleanest skies in the world, right? Pretty much.
Well, I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, if you look at, quality of air index compared to other industrialized countries, like the U.S. has some.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We'll get into this in terms of like final conclusion and what the trends are now, but actually China is investing a lot in green energy recently. They might have an incentive to do that. I was thinking because a lot of their population is dying from air pollution, so stuff like that. They have an incentive actually. And I mean, maybe we'll all get together and agree to take action together, and since we know that this is a big enough issue, it won't be the case that we're all trying to act selfishly.
I mean, we've done that before. In when the ozone layer was getting depleted, we went and I forgot the what's it called? What we did, but yeah, we made sure the ozone layer starts closing back and didn't expand. Do you guys remember that?
How?
I think that was before our.
It was, I think, in 1990, the Montreal Protocol takes effect.
But you're right. They're like, that's what we're trying to do now with the Paris climate.
When people say we can't make any change, we can. We've done it.
We can't cooperate national or globally,
Exactly,
but we can.
yeah. We can.
And it really, back to the whole foreign aid thing, it also depends on how much support wealthy nations, and just like the moral impetus for us to help, others reach that stage without giving them any support and expecting that same, jump.
Yeah. What do y'all think about doing like individual actions, like reducing your individual consumption, eating less meat, biking to work and school as solutions to this?
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
Look, there is a collective action problem here, so unless everyone does it, then one person, unfortunately, is.
I like my meat.
It's the tragedy of the commons once again.
If we all ate bugs, what do you guys think about that? Eating crickets and all that?
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
I don't know about that.
Oh my god.
And biking, brother, 10-minute bike to the...
You already biked to school. I don't know why you're complaining.
Yeah, it's 10 minutes. Biking to office, I'd go crazy.
I think I might one wheel. But yeah, I think it's worth the extra floods to not eat bugs.
That's crazy.
That's a crazy ass statement.
I mean, but all right, we are having electric vehicles on the way, and people are, changing it up. So maybe we are playing a part. Maybe not.
Well, but are they using electric vehicles because of the climate, or because they're cool
or because of air pollution?
Yeah, at least they're doing something.
Yeah,
at least it's something.
They probably feel better about themselves either way, no matter.
Can we all agree that we're not doing paper straws? That's insane. I can't get behind that.
Oh, I actually do like straws that aren't plastic. I'm not gonna lie.
This is crazy.
No, it's a very cheap solution for removing plastic. That's
but it's so annoying drinking it.
No, I agree. I don't like paper, but there's also there's other types of compostable materials like corn syrup.
I mean, they have decomposable straws in the dining halls, and they don't disintegrate. So
yeah, as long as it doesn't disintegrate.
So that's the thing. Like, I was pretty surprised. I was like, wait a second, what? A few years ago, we were all using stupid paper straws in Disney World and stuff that melt immediately in your drink.
We're back
and
to
now
not doing that.
they've got plastic that's actually plastic straws that are decomposable. So that can lead us into the next point, which maybe innovation in material science and green energy, bringing the cost down, battery storage, all stuff like that. Maybe this is more of an engineering problem, and that's the real solution to all this.
Yeah.
You don't sound convinced.
It's not happening enough in a fast enough pace, though. That's the problem. Like, they gave us paper straws first, and everybody hated it. So, like, when I hear of biodegradable stuff, like, I know it's the stupidest thing ever that these are the small comforts that I have to give up for the environment, but it's just annoying.
But the kin straws aren't paper. They're fine, right?
Yeah, the kin straws aren't bad, but I don't use the straws there. So
I mean, nothing is ever going to change unless what we have is more. No, well, if our alternatives are either cheaper, more convenient, or people don't notice. Because if you didn't notice, then hey, we're doing
okay. As long as it's not noticeable, that's a dub.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But there has to be a profit incentive because we live in a profit motivated world, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, but I think there is a profit incentive, and all the world's greatest entrepreneurs and scientists have all been devoting so much time into this issue. And I mean, solar power has gone down in price like 10 times, I think, by 10 times in the past 10 years.
Yeah.
So now it's like on par with natural gas. So, and then there's so much potential, like lab grown artificial meat instead of factory farming, or genetic engineering climate resistant crops. And even like we're talking about in the next 100 years, we just did an episode that said we might have colonized Mars and moons on Jupiter by then. So maybe we can do like large scale geoengineering and have complete control over our climate by then, with solar shades in the space, either beaming back solar energy to Earth or reflecting the light back and mitigating the sun's rays by like 10% to reduce any runaway climate effects that we have by then. So we have no idea what technologies are going to happen in the next 100 years. I mean, venture capitalists and AI researchers are saying we could have artificial super intelligence in 20 years. So, and maybe that'll just solve every problem humanity has ever had in the first couple minutes that it's on. So, I mean, it's crazy, and it's very optimistic, I guess, but it just seems silly to put so much investment into saving these hypothetical poor people that are going to exist 100 and any people. But I mean, it disproportionately affects the poor people, the effects of climate change. So we're going to put all this investment into saving them, sacrificing the poor people today to save poor people 100 to 200 years in the future, when we have no idea what the technology is going to be like.
But I mean, you have to keep in mind that this is already affecting poor people today, right? I mean, we have poor people in more polluted areas, for instance.
But I would argue that allowing the free markets with cheap energy and allowing those places to develop does more good in terms of allowing them to fight diseases, more maternal and child care, and just being more developed in general prevents more deaths than what climate change is causing.
Well, that doesn't change what we can do in the U.S. as a country.
I mean, yeah, the U.S. is, I guess, different, but like it goes back to the point.
The point is, in the U.S., like, yes, it is going to be a problem in the developing nations, but in the U.S., it's not, based on what we talked about for the potential threats. We're talking about a couple thousand people a year from natural disasters. So
I'm not talking about natural disasters. I'm talking about cities like Phoenix running out of water.
Okay, but like, you think we're not going to have any ways to adapt to those changes by then?
No, I'm saying that we had to look at this in the sense of there's problems now. They're only going to get worse in the future, but the problems still exist now, and they are still affecting people like differently now, right?
I mean, the technological advances could mitigate it. Like, who knows?
No, I agree, and that's in the future. But like, investment has to go towards that right now.
Maybe it already is.
No, it is,
and
but
we don't know about it yet.
Yeah, I think a lot of the progress that we're seeing is because of advances in the private sector in green energy, because of all the investment going into it from the private sector. where that's why it's become on par with oil and natural gas, which was like unthinkable 10 years ago. So,
well, I mean, okay, like, I mean, at the very least, we can agree that this entire problem isn't going to just be saved by some government initiative, right? Like we said, it's going to require a restructuring at all levels. That means that if we can try, or like, if the private sector either aligns with these causes or there is a profit motive to help develop these technologies to help mitigate those problems in the future, that is as effective or more effective than any government intervention, right? But they have to work in conjunction with each other. And none of these changes, like you said, it's going to be detrimental if we're like, to any developed nations, you guys can't use coal because we want you to use solar panels, right? I mean, obviously that's going to have a worse effect than helping, lifting the poor people of that country out of poverty, right? But that's like, that can be, that problem is tackled by both the government intervention as well as the private sector.
Yeah.
I
mean, that's all. And actually today, one of the good news now that wind and solar is so cheap, it's actually in a lot of cases more economically, it's a worse business decision to use coal energy, even in the developing nations. So that's part of the good news, is that it's not like these countries have to use coal in order to be viable, because we've proven that we can start decoupling green energy from GDP now. So
I agree. So like if you think about California banning electric cars by 2030, is that going to work? No, right? But at the same time,
the manufacturers are already going back on that.
No,
so let the market work all that out itself.
But if we have government incentives to produce certain sort of technologies, like subsidies to, like we already saw subsidies working for like electric cars, for instance, or renewable energy products. Exactly. Those are probably,
or like a carbon tax to add externalities that the market doesn't account for, like air pollution. That all makes sense. It's just the drastic actions that people take issue with.
Yeah, exactly. But I think whenever people talk about this, they only really look at like one extreme of the problem. And have you guys heard of the preparedness paradox? This kind of ties into it, but
what is it?
Basically, it's that if we act together to mitigate a disaster right now, 100 years in the future, we're going to look back and say, like, wow, nothing really changed. It wasn't that bad, but that only came about because we
did something now.
Exactly.
Well, so I can see that happening.
That makes sense.
What is
my point is that that is only that kind of like perceiving of that this isn't really that bad. Sure, that may be the case, but that may be only the case right now because of the things we've done maybe 20 years ago, right? If you already look, for example, like our shift from in the US to renewable energy sources, even the small amount that we have, that shift has led to like our emissions going down as well, right? So like just based on like how carbon is already acting in the atmosphere right now and how everything is getting worse, that like change is gonna get bigger over time. Like the effect of what we're gonna how do I say this? Like the effect of the last 20 years is going to be a lot smaller than the effect of all this going forward the next 20 years.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Because this is growing exponentially, right?
The problem is?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, that's a good point that I also wanted to note, is that the actions we take now are more going to be vastly more effective than any solutions in the future, because this is a compounding issue that isn't necessarily reversible. So something like waiting for nuclear fusion, which I wanted to mention, I think in 20 years or maybe even 10, we'll have cheap nuclear fusion energy that only produces water as a waste product and is cheaper than all other sources. And then this won't be an issue, but by then maybe it'll be too late and you can't reverse the carbon that's already in the atmosphere.
Exactly.
Although maybe we could, carbon capture is another promising technology that could potentially reverse it. But all right, let's get into, you were kind of starting to talk about it now, the trends that we're seeing. And is this overall a solution that we can stop are we all doomed, or are we moving in the right direction? I've got some stats if y'all don't.
Well, why don't we start with the stats and then we can give our final opinions on this.
Okay. I mean, it's stuff like 9% of new cars now sold are electric. That was definitely not the case 10 years ago. Like I said, solar in the past decade, solar got 10 times cheaper. Battery prices have decreased 60% in the past decade. Climate policies are expected to limit warming to only 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Climate policies right now. And we have proven that we can decouple carbon emissions and GDP, because in the US and now in China that they've started investing in it, and mainly in Europe, their GDP is still growing at a normal rate and emissions are falling. And a couple more stats. Renewables already account for 42% of electricity generation. And China, like I said, I was super surprised, added more solar capacity in the last year than the US has in its entire history. So that was one of the biggest concerns, because they're the biggest polluter, that they're not gonna, and so is India, by the way. They're two huge polluters that we weren't sure would be moving in this direction, and it seems like they actually are, mainly by stopping burning coal, which is the biggest pollutant. So that was a lot, but
yeah, I think when you look at those case studies, I mean, you look at their development, they've done in 20 years what we've like been doing for like the last 40. Like everything is just moving.
So they're doing it faster.
Well, yeah, like their growth has been like incredible, right? These last these last 10, 20 years, and their environments in the countries, like we look at the air quality in China and India, and it's like the worst in the world. I mean, it's like that for a reason, and it's because of environmental degradation and air pollution that it's only now, like even more so than climate change, that's what's motivating them to pursue these technologies.
Right. And I mean, if that's what is going to be the incentive, then that's great.
Yeah, exactly. So are we moving in the right direction? Yeah. I mean, is it just for
maybe once they
itself?
Fix the air pollution issue, will they continue to make the changes that we need? Maybe.
Well, I mean, I guess we're lucky that fixing air pollution also is correlated to fixing climate change.
Yeah, but say they like get to a point where we don't have much air pollution problems, but we're still producing a large proportion of the world emissions.
That's true. But regardless, we'll be in a better place then than we are today.
Generally, it's an optimistic case for the future is what I'm trying to make. Versus don't have children because we're all going to die to climate change. And
yeah, I mean, whether we die or not, I don't know if it's going to be to climate change, but I mean, at the very least, we have a responsibility to our kids in the future to make sure that this world is a better place than we left it, right? Mm-hmm. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, I can agree on that.
Okay, so I've got, do you want to add more for your final?
That was my final thought. What about you?
Final thoughts?
I think it just comes down to,
if you were the government and you had absolute dictatorial control, well, maybe that's not the right idea, but what solutions should we be pursuing, I guess, to add? Actually?
I mean, I think we've come down to the understanding that nuclear seems to be the most viable option. But in general, though, like I'm just saying that it's better to do something than nothing. I think that's what it comes down to. It's better to make sure that the temperature doesn't increase by 10 degrees. And instead, if it increases by 5, at least we're doing something better. We're right. It's half as much as concern, and like you said, we're leaving the world a better place for our kids and the future generations. Sometimes you might be like, why do I care? Like my life might be fine, and I don't really care about the future generations. But most people do end up still caring about at least their offspring and the next generation.
Right? Yeah, sadly enough, yeah,
100%. So people are realizing the impacts, and they're changing for the better. And for countries like China and India, they've also learned from our mistakes and what we've done. So at least they know what side to not head into. So like you said, like he said, they've done more this year than any other year. And we already know that China is pretty crazy with their development. Like I'm pretty sure the electric vehicles that they sell are like above 50%, or electric vehicles, new vehicles that are getting. I'm not sure if that status right, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty high. So compared to us, these countries are already starting on it quicker than us. So I think overall we'll be fine. Like in the end, something might happen, but but instead of it happening in 2,000 years, it'll happen 200 years. It'll happen 500 years later.
No, yeah,
you
sure.
know?
And it's like the preparedness paradox. If we make it where our future selves will be like, whoa, never really was that bad.
Yeah,
and we know we left it
exactly.
in a good spot.
So I think that's what it comes down to, and that's basically my thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, basically, I think based on the stats that we can look at, and that's all we can do as laypersons that don't study the climate on a daily basis, the temperatures throughout the earth are warming, and we're seeing the effects of that, and it's man-made, and it's going to have pretty negative impacts that are going to especially impact underdeveloped regions, and it's going to be quite the nuisance and uncomfortable, and we're going to have to make big adaptations as a species. But the great thing is we've been fighting nature and winning for the past hundreds of years, or thousands even, and ultimately humans are better at adaptation than mitigation, and also going on to the saving the lives and improving the quality of life of these underdeveloped countries. We've learned based on the past 200 years that the best way to improve quality of life and save lives is by free market capitalism and cheap energy. So we need to keep that in mind, and maybe now that we can use solar and wind as cheap energy sources, and France has proven nuclear is viable, maybe we can help these underdeveloped countries improve their quality of life with even cheap energy sources. But ultimately, the world is not going to end due to climate change. There's no scenario where that's the case. Even the worst, like humanity will survive even in the worst case scenarios. So yeah, I think we should invest in nuclear energy, like you said. We definitely should not burn coal anywhere, and invest in technological advancements like nuclear fusion, carbon capture, sustainable building, continuing to drop the prices of green energy in the private sector. And I think any climate alarmism is counterproductive because it breeds skepticism, like we talked about in the first section. So,
okay, is that it?
I think that's a wrap. Yeah.
All right, guess we'll see you guys on episode 7.
Yeah, thank you for
Peace
listening.
out. Yeah, make sure to like, follow, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. I think we have a TikTok account now.
Yeah, and hopefully Hussein
We do.
will come back from the dead.
Oh yeah.